This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by Energy Hub. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the USEA Power Sector Podcast series on virtual power plants, or VPPs, my guest is Allison Clements, a former commissioner with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and currently principal of Policy and Strategy Consultant 804 Advisory. Allison's going to outline the 4 actionable state-level policies in her recent Utility Dive opinion piece that can quickly start turning around the growing concerns with rising electricity costs in the United States. Allison began her over 2-decade career in energy policy as a private sector attorney, then moved to the Natural Resources Defense Council, and in 2017 founded and led Good Grid, an energy sector consultant. She then worked with the U.S. Energy Foundation, advocating for clean energy investment, until she was appointed to FERC by President Trump in December 2020 and completed her 4-year term under President Biden. Allison, your Utility Dive editorial, co-written with a friend of our podcast, the World Resource Institute's Lori Bird, starts with a call for state legislators and regulators to require AI-based integrated planning from their utilities and system operators. Now, I've often written about the importance of integrated planning, and this podcast actually did a whole series on it last year. But why are you starting with something that's sort of so wonky and complicated as integrated planning? And why are you talking about AI?
Well, thanks, Herman, for having me. It's great to be here, and it's great to get the chance to work with Lori Bird at WRI's Polsky Center. Affordability is the conversation of the moment, right? And When you think about how we're going to solve for the electricity affordability challenge, I tend to think of it in 2 steps, the short term and everything beyond the short term. And there's parallel tracks running related to the opportunity to make change that then trickles down through to customer bills. And so a main premise of the reason we started with AI is that a main premise of the piece Lori and I wrote is that there is latent efficiency to be harnessed and monetized within our existing grid infrastructure. That means that across all the poles and wires and substations and control rooms, there is efficiency that we don't have to pay a whole bunch more money to harness. And that's the way that you start kind of putting a cap on rising bills in the near term. So why AI? There is so much data related to system planning, whether you're talking about your own utility service territory or broad regional markets, the whole Midwest or the whole Mid-Atlantic. And the data doesn't usually talk to each other. And right. It's often, you might be doing planning looking forward to 2030, 2035, and you might say, oh, shoot, those models don't talk to each other. And so we have to go in and manually input changes, and the load forecast has changed in this one and we forgot about this one. And so the ability to use an AI agent or bot that kind of sits in the middle of that complexity of data and cuts through it quickly, but with integrity, in order to provide the opportunity to do much quicker and relatively affordable system planning. And I like to think of it, and I work with a group, Tapestry, who does some of this AI-enabled grid software planning, all the way from the planning phase through to the grid interconnection, when resources are hooking up to the grid, through to the operations phase. Now, whether or not those need to be one AI model is a different question, but the fact that you can enable a whole lot smarter, quicker, more efficient system planning and operation through the use of technology is really critical.
I want to add, that planning is how utilities evolve. If they aren't planning, and they do plan, but they have to incorporate all kinds of information in their planning. Traditionally, utilities have planned with the limited information for the limited system back in the day, when basically all they had was coal and nuclear and a few other things. Now there's so many options: customer-owned resources, wind and solar, as well as the traditional resources. So it's all these resources are part of silos in the utility. when a customer sees their bill, they just see a number that they have to pay, an amount of money they have to pay. They don't see that that's the result of an enormous amount of consolidation of information. And what you're saying is AI can do that consolidation better, I think. Am I getting that right, Allison?
That's one absolutely excellent use. It can get that information better. It can ensure kind of accurate, quick, rapid reporting and access to data for customers. I think it also works on the front end as you're engaging in that planning of evolution process to ensure that the investment choices that utilities are making are optimized and are kept only where they need to be. And I think you imply another important premise of the article, and it's something you always have to say when you're talking about electricity bills. And that is, unlike other infrastructure development, if I live in the District of Columbia, if the city's coming through and replacing our water pipes and paving over a road, that's coming from the general treasury of the city, right? Or the state
Right.
pot, or the federal pot. But when it comes to utility bills, any of that grid infrastructure, the generation and the poles and wires, that's coming from that payment comes from utility customers via their electricity bill. And it's not as straightforward as, my utility Pepco makes an investment and I pay a portion of it. There's lots of calculations and crazy things that happen between here and there, but it does trickle through. And so that's why the challenge of both building out the grid we need and maintaining affordability, is so hard, because it's not just like there's a bucket of money available.
Right. And the other part of that same equation is something that people at utilities and outside utilities have told me for years in my reporting, which is that there are better options that simply don't get into planning until you get this better ability to assimilate the data. That's where you started with your first answer. But let's move on to something else, which, by the way, is a prime example of something that didn't get into planning, the savings that were possible that didn't get into planning until recent years. Your editorial calls for states to push their utilities and their system operators to deploy advanced transmission technologies. What are those technologies? And why are they such a good early step?
So I'll start with the second half of the question. And I've been a kind of a cheerleader for advanced grid technologies for several years now, because they're they're no brainers.
Right.
So I like to compare it to the way we operate our grid to my life as a carpool mom. So I drive 3 kids to swimming all year, right? Early in the morning, come bring them back. At night, bring them back. But 4 or 5 days a year, we have an extra kid because their parent can't drive them. But so I don't go out and buy a new car that's going to fit more kids. I use my middle seat 4 days of the year, right? And the middle seat's a little less comfortable, and people have to take turns using it. But you make use of the infrastructure you have.
So you don't have to buy a new car.
You don't have to buy a new car. Well, our grid is planned by the new car model. It is designed for those hottest days of the year and the coldest days of the year. So 95% of the days of the year, there's lots of room on the grid. We don't need more space. You can flow all the electrons you need. But when power demand is really high and the grid is really stressed by the weather, that's the time when you need to use your middle seat. And these advanced transmission technologies, which are both software programs and hardware, like things you literally clamp onto the poles and wires in your neighborhood, those things together take advantage of the middle seat. And so most of the year you're good, but on middle seat days, you've got these technologies that are going to help clear up the room, prioritize dispatch, and ensure that we, keep going reliably without big spend. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to ever need big spend. We're going to have to invest in our grid. It's going to have to get bigger, especially with kind of the rush of data centers and new load growth coming online. But in the near term, in the immediate, the quickest and fastest way to avoid increases in bills is to take advantage of these grid enhancing technologies.
Yeah, and what we mean by those technologies are, number one, there's new kinds of literally the wires that people see streaming across the sky, which can carry more information. So, and that doesn't mean that you're not going to have to build more transmission to bring new resources into the utilities, but the more power that the wires can carry, the longer time we can postpone or take, not necessarily postpone, but take to build those new systems, right?
That's exactly right. That's another great technology, advanced conductoring. And that's an option on the menu of these advanced transmission technologies that utilities can take advantage of. The barriers have been, in some cases, but not all, the technology has been new. Some of it's old. And the way that it kind of gets integrated into the operating system of utilities is a challenge. It's a new challenge. And frankly, the utility incentive is to build new infrastructure. It's kind of, it's the traditional way of doing things. Your grid gets crowded, you build another, you buy a new car. You don't use the middle seat. That's just the way it's been done. And so there's both an economic incentive issue there, as well as a kind of a cultural, institutional, conservative operations perspective, which is fair because these are the people who keep our lights on and would be in trouble if they didn't, right?
Right. Here's a quick note from the sponsor of our series of podcasts about virtual power plants, Energy Hub. What if everyday devices had the potential to strengthen the grid when it's needed most? Energy Hub helps utilities turn that potential into dependable capacity by coordinating thermostats, EVs, batteries, and other devices so they work together as virtual power plants, or VPPs, that respond to grid needs in near real time. Energy Hub's latest white paper lays out a maturity model for VPPs that can be planned and dispatched with the same confidence as conventional plants while being 40 to 60% less expensive to build. That's why more than 160 utilities across North America partner with Energy Hub to manage over 2.5 million devices that provide 3.4 gigawatts of flexible capacity. Read the white paper and discover what VPPs can do for your grid at energyhub.com. Okay, let's move to the next subject. In your editorial, you talk about the big returns from virtual power plants, or VPPs, that are made up, these virtual power plants, of relatively small customer-owned distributed resources, or DER, things like home solar and battery systems, smart thermostats, EV charging systems. How can state policy enable these VPPs and the power of numbers and the software platforms that they offer to utilities?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets exciting, right? And it also gets a little dizzying if you're sitting in your living room trying to say, like, are you serious? I'm going to hook up my thermostat and my oven and my heat, pump and my EV, and they're going to come put solar on my roof. And so it's a little bit like hard to believe, but at the same time, the opportunity is massive. And it is, again, because it takes a long time to build new poles and wires and to build new power plants. This is something that in the nearer term, at a relatively lower cost, can be harnessed to provide grid capability, right? If you are using less, there's more room on the system for other stuff that needs electrons. If you have more than you need because your battery has been storing the energy that your rooftop's been creating, then you have something to offer, and you should be paid for that service, right? It empowers people and communities to become part of the solution. And so it seems like small ball, but we've seen, we know in real life experience, as well as studies that are out there. There was a good recent one that I know Utility Dive covered by Rewiring America that said literally all of the new data center demand across the 13 mid-Atlantic states, which is called, the grid operator is called PJM, could be met with combinations and smart deployment of these virtual power plant resources. So if you add all this stuff up together, they basically can get to the megawatt level of a big gas plant, or in fact, in the Northeast, an entire nuclear plant. So there's a ton of opportunity, but the issues are all kind of regulatory and technical operational barriers. So there are a few things you need to do to enable this opportunity, whether you're in a vertically integrated state where the utility owns generation, poles and wires together, or you're in a competitive state where the utility only owns the poles and wires, and then the generation is
competitively procured. Yeah. And I want to add something that we've said many times on the podcast, that virtual power plants, the using of customers' resources has absolutely nothing to do with any kind of austerity required of the customers. In fact, the people that are doing today's virtual power plants, are talking about a very soft touch, a very careful touch with all the participants, so they barely notice any change. But if a million customers turn down their thermostats 2 degrees, it's not going to change the temperature in their homes significantly, but it's going to make a huge amount of difference in the amount of energy that gets consumed by the overall system, right?
Absolutely. And you know, I take that for granted. So I forget that that is the most important thing for most people to think about, which that this product wouldn't succeed in the market if it didn't do exactly that, maintain kind of regular opportunity in the way that you experience your electricity today. And you asked what the policy fixes are, and there are a bunch of wacky terms like, you know, make sure that all the advanced meters that exist in homes are turned on and that the data is getting used. Ensure that, you know, settlements for how much customers owes based on their actual use and not some kind of utility-wide average. Compel the utility via incentives to do everything it can to enable other parties to come in and, you know, monetize batteries or other infrastructure that the utility might own. There's a whole bunch of fixes depending on where you are, but without kind of losing ourselves in the weeds. It's a nearer term opportunity that states can take advantage of.
Those things are all covered in we're working on this series on virtual power plants, and our listeners who have been paying attention have already heard some of that. I want to go to one more question, the fourth item in your editorial. But I want to make a point before we go on, because this is about large load tariffs and the dealing with hyperscalers that are building the data centers. I've been saying for the last year that for various political reasons, I'm not going to go into them, an enormous amount of talent is being pushed out of Washington, D.C., and it's going to wind up, it already is winding up at the state level. As I understand it, you've been working with Governor Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey on designing her energy policy. Is that correct?
That's right. I co-chair the transition team's energy effort, and know that they really hit the ground running there related to quick fixes, just sitting down, kind of combing the books, looking at all their existing authorities. And, you know, they announced a rate freeze as kind of a political commitment, but they full well know that that's not the kind of end game on policy, that they're not just looking to defer investment, but they're really looking to harness community energy, the kind of EPP stuff we talked about, in a big way to help New Jerseyans take back control of their kind of own energy costs, because they live in a region where the regional grid power has gotten really expensive. So yeah, there's a ton that states can do, but it's kind of it's unique to every state. The geography, the politics, and the policies are different. And I think the silver lining of the affordability challenge is that it doesn't matter your political stripes, you still care about electricity affordability and what you owe in your utility bill every month. And that creates a chance for people to sit down and roll up their sleeves and get to work on this stuff.
And by the way, I don't want to go into this in any great length. I want to move to our last question, but I believe your co-chair was also somebody who was formerly in the federal government, is now working at the state level. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that was former Secretary Jennifer Granholm. And I think what excited her about coming to help out at the state level was her belief that in this moment of high load growth and affordability of rising prices, that there was an opportunity to harness utilities and reform incentives for utilities in a way that makes them get to the results we need to see.
Yeah. And I've been talking to a lot of people who are frustrated with things that are happening in our federal government. Not everybody is, but a lot of people are. And especially with this issue that's coming up from hyperscalers building data centers and potentially imposing costs on other electricity users. And I keep telling them there's a lot that can be done at the state level. And I think that's what you're doing. Am I right?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that actually among the many things the federal administration has done, they've taken some good moves related to this data center issue. So, I think there's opportunity at both, but the states are really kind of key moving forward.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, Allison, but the last policy that you and Lori Bird talk about in your editorial is these large load tariffs for our less tech savvy people. Tariff is essentially a rate and all the rules that go with it, but it's the rate. So in other words, a special rate that protect residential and small business electricity customers from the costs that otherwise could be opposed by hyperscalers building these data centers. What can happen? How can state policies protect ratepayers? Especially, just throw in this other point, which you make in your editorial, which is that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is working on this. So why should states get involved?
Right. Well, we could have Herman, you and I could spend the next day talking about the last question.
Yes.
And so
I
think
apologize for stuffing this
it's great.
into it.
It's great. It means I'll come back again soon. But I think 2 points to make. I'm working with data center developers and end use customers. The end use customers are the ones you hear about, the Meta, the Oracle, the Google. None of them want to do anything other than pay their fair share. There is not, they didn't have to kind of figure it all out early on when there was lots of kind of existing surplus room on the grid to plug in. But it's not as though they're coming up saying, we don't want to pay our fair share. The problem is, what does it mean to pay your fair share in such a complicated structure where you've got state and federal regulators who weigh in on several different components that ultimately coalesce into your utility bill at the end of the month? And so that's the problem. And that's kind of the layered onion we're trying to work out. And the reason states should get involved, well, states are involved, number one. States have exercised jurisdiction to create the rules for when these large loads hook up to the grid. What has happened is now the large loads are hooking up to the big grid, the big wires that are the FERC jurisdiction or the federal regulator. And so the states are kind of reflexively pushing back against that federal proposal for the federal government to get involved, when really, from my perspective, it's a pretty good idea to create some standardization and some efficiency. But states should stay involved because, number one, that rule, even if it gets finalized, isn't going to be implemented and effective, 12 months from now? You tell me. And we're only talking about some of the data centers, right? The ones hooking up to the big grid. The ones hooking up to the distribution system, the small grid, will still be state jurisdictional. And the last point is that they will also still have rules to protect residential customers that will always be the responsibility of the states for that end use retail sale. And so, subject to Congress getting involved, which on that front is hard to imagine, the states are still ultimately going to have the say on what goes into their retail customer bills.
All right. Well, and that's the good news too, because they will have the say, they will have a voice in protecting residential and small business customers. That's all the time we have. It's been great. We're going to have you back. You already volunteered, so you're stuck with us. We're going to have you back to talk more about large load tariffs. My guest today has been former FERC Commissioner Allison Clements, now principal of 804 Advisory, and she's discussed the 4 state-level policy actions that her editorial in Utility Dive says can quickly start turning around the growing concerns with rapidly rising electricity rates. I also want to thank our sponsor, Energy Hub, my producer, Melissa Brown, and as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.